lab has conducted research based upon a mathematical reformulation of quantum mechanics, which resulted in a more precise model of the atom. In addition, data produced by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology revealed the atomic nucleus retains heat as the new nuclear model predicted. It has revealed the fact about heating and cooling at temperatures typical of the Earth. Earth temperatures retain a portion of the heat in the nucleus and do not radiate the heat off into space. This discovery, not currently recognized by science, challenges the orthodoxy of greenhouse gas global warming. The climatologist Dr. D. Rapp shows that climate, or the local heat energy environment, is the result of the balance between radiant heat received from the sun and heat lost by thermal radiation from the Earth. As the illustration shows, the whole of the Earth's surface releases thermal radiation. It is important to understand that the radiation output is not a direct measure of energy. It is a measure of heat energy being relieved. Wattage is the per second output of energy. Wattage is a measure of heat energy being released over time. Rapp's emphasis on thermal radiation as being, quote, the temperature profile of the Earth from the surface to the stratosphere, unquote, identifies the orthodoxy. It is believed that the Earth's atmosphere modifies thermal radiation heat loss. During the night, the heat energy received from the sun during the day is radiated off into space. Atmospheric conditions can indeed affect this heat loss from thermal radiation into space. If water vapor saturation exceeds 100%, droplets will precipitate out as clouds. These clouds will reflect back the Earth's thermal radiation, preventing it from escaping into space. The Earth's heat will be retained. The orthodoxy believes that atmospheric carbon dioxide acts like cloud cover. They believe that CO2 also reflects back thermal radiation, retaining heat. There's a problem with this orthodox belief. Water vapor as a greenhouse gas requires an excess of 100% atmospheric saturation. Atmospheric carbon dioxide, even after man's contribution, is only 1 part per 2,500 or 0.04 of 1%. The publisher's review of my book, Poison Science, shows that greenhouse gas orthodoxy has converted science into an anti-scientific belief system. Dawson points out that carbon dioxide is only a trace element within the atmosphere at 1 part per 2,500. Yet this trace CO2 is proposed as having a, quote, superthermal radiation blockage, unquote, atmospheric function by computer models. The actual capacity of trace atmospheric carbon dioxide to block the Earth's off radiation of its heat to act as a greenhouse gas is never measured. Computer modeling has replaced actual measurement in what Dawson calls, quote, the transformation of science from objectively referenced categories to socially enforced belief systems, unquote. In order to explain the Earth's retention of a portion of the heat it received during the day, mathematical models were constructed. These models proposed that atmospheric carbon dioxide blocked thermal radiation at 50 times CO2's atmospheric density. It is alleged that CO2's 400 parts per million blocks approximately 2% of the Earth's thermal radiation, or 50 times its density. This figure of 50 times atmospheric density is given in an article in Scientific American explaining why such a small CO2 component in the atmosphere could have such a large impact upon the climate. The article was written by Peter Tans of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Tan writes, quote, currently, the total heating produced by the increase of all long-lived greenhouse gases, excluding water vapor, since pre-industrial times is equal to about 1% of all solar radiation absorbed at the surface, unquote. That is, increases in carbon dioxide since the Industrial Revolution have increased heat retention by 1%, according to the orthodoxy. This 1% increase in heat retention is explained by an increase in CO2 since the Industrial Revolution of 200 parts per million. An increase of 0.02 of a percentage point of atmospheric CO2 is presumed to explain an increase of 1% of heat retention. The heat retention increase is said to be 50 times the increase of CO2 due to industrialization. It is possible to test the superradiation blockage hypothesis, but such a scientific test has never been performed by the orthodoxy. Our lab has designed a scientific test of the orthodoxy's hypothesis that atmospheric carbon dioxide blocks thermal radiation at a rate of 50 times CO2's atmospheric density. Orthodoxy's CO2 hypothesis may be tested during radiation frosts. A radiation frost occurs on cold, clear nights when air temperatures approach freezing, but is prevented from falling below freezing by latent heat of condensation. However, Earth elements can fall below freezing by radiating their heat into space. The amount of separation between air and Earth temperatures is a measure of radiation heat loss into space. Radiation frosts during cold, clear nights are a concern to fruit growers because tender fruit buds can be killed by freezing. An instrument which measures radiation-induced temperatures of fruit buds and leaves has been developed. This graph was produced by such an instrument. If this instrument is accurate in temperature measurements to 1/100th of a degree, it can be used to test orthodoxy's superradiation blockage hypothesis. Such a test can be made because an urban CO2 dome is known to exist over metropolitan Phoenix, Arizona. CO2 concentrations are greater in the city center than they are on the periphery. In a 1998 study of the Phoenix CO2 dome, it was discovered that the variance in CO2 atmospheric concentrations between the center and outlying points were nearly 200 parts per million. The variance approached the increases alleged to have accompanied industrialization. CO2 measured 550 parts per million at the dome center and 370 parts per million in rural areas. The measures were taken at dawn. The high concentrations disappeared at midday because the active plant's photosynthesis converted the CO2 to oxygen. These CO2 dome measurements were taken in January during the average frost season for Phoenix, which lasts between December 12th and February 7th. They provide excellent conditions to test orthodoxy's superblockage thermal radiation hypothesis. The 185 parts per million CO2 in the dome center should increase radiation blockage by nearly 1%. During a radiation frost, the variance between air temperature and radiation-cooled elements should be 1% less at the dome center. This would be a direct test of the orthodoxy's hypothesis that atmospheric CO2 can block thermal radiation at a rate of 50 times atmospheric density. Yet the orthodoxy has made no such direct test of their hypothesis. How then have they tried to prove it? In 1998, Penn State's Michael Mann issued a graph purporting to show average temperatures for the Earth over the last 1,000 years. The graph shows a steep increase in temperatures starting about 1900 or after modern technology came into general use with automobiles and electrification. It is alleged the 20th century saw a great increase in atmospheric CO2 from car engines, factories, and power plants, and that this is the reason for the temperature increase. There are two problems with this man-proof of orthodoxy CO2 hypothesis, one being conceptual and the other methodological. First, the independent variable, that being atmospheric CO2 levels, cannot be isolated by the man data as the cause. Alleged temperature increases can also be explained by a second factor. Widespread use of modern technology also invests heat energy into the environment. The internal combustion engine operates at high temperatures and gives off heat. This is also true of widespread use of electric utilities. Temperature increases cannot be explained by modern CO2 increases alone. There is data to test the effects of the concentration of modern technology. In the valley, which includes Phoenix, Arizona, the high-density urban center averages 10% more frost-free days than do outlying areas. A test of the Phoenix CO2 dome would determine if the climate optima were due to CO2. By taking radiation emission readings in January under radiation frost conditions, it can be determined if the center of the city blocks 1% more thermal radiation as predicted by the orthodoxy CO2 hypothesis. If the readings confirm the hypothesis, it may be concluded that the Phoenix climate optima results from increased CO2 densities in the domes covering the city. If, however, the radiation frost readings do not confirm the 50 times density blockage by CO2, then the Phoenix climate optima must be accounted for by the increase in heat energy input by modern technology. The existence of the Phoenix CO2 dome and the Phoenix climate optima provides an opportunity to test orthodoxy's super blockage CO2 hypothesis. The second problem with Michael Mann's graph of temperature change over the last 1,000 years is that the graph significantly exaggerates the temperature rise during the last 100 years. The temperature rise exaggeration is explained in an article in Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Technology Review. The article shows that a deceptive computer program was used to exaggerate the modern temperature rise. Two Canadian scientists, Stephen McIntyre and Ross McKittrick, explained how this was done. Using different temperature readings, such as a thermometer reading and tree ring estimates, require that the different methods of be normalized into a single graph. McIntyre and McKittrick got hold of Mann's normalization program. They discovered that the computer program Michael Mann used exaggerated temperature rises. The exaggeration has a hockey stick shape in that the Earth's temperatures are relatively flat for 1,000 years and then abruptly increase at the beginning of the 20th century. The MIT article described the computer program bias by the following, quote, "The improper normalization procedure tends to emphasize any data that do have a hockey stick shape and to suppress all data that do not. McIntyre and McKittrick created some meaningless test data that had no average, no trend. When they fed these data into the Mann procedure, out popped a hockey stick shape," unquote. There is a methodological problem with the Mann normalization computer model. He used data between 1902 and 1980 as his base period, a period which includes thermometer readings as well as natural estimates. Prior to the 20th century, temperatures were estimated from phenomena out of nature. For example, during colder years, trees do not grow as much, and the rings left in the trunk will be thinner than those from warmer years. The problem is to estimate temperatures from the thickness and thinness of tree rings. This is not an exact science when compared to temperature readings taken by a thermometer. At the beginning of the 20th century, thermometer readings were included with the natural estimates of temperature. A normalization mathematical model was required to integrate thermometer readings with natural estimates. The normalization model Michael Mann chose was scientifically invalid and designed to exaggerate modern temperature gains. During the 1902 to 1980 period, the average of all natural estimated temperatures fell below the mean baseline. In contrast, most of the thermometer readings fell above the line. Clearly, the natural estimates using tree rings fell below measured temperatures by thermometer. The mathematical way of handling the data would be to correct the natural estimates between the year 1000 AD and 1902. During the 1000 AD to 1902 period, all temperatures were natural estimates and thermometer readings were not available. By Mann's own 1902 to 1980 data, these natural estimates are low. The Canadians McIntyre and McKittrick show that the Mann normalization program did not make the required adjustments for bias between thermometer readings and natural estimates. The low estimated readings were left in place for the estimation period between 1000 AD and 1902. As a result, the temperature gains after 1902 were artificially high. The Canadians then plugged random numbers into the Mann program. They used numbers which showed no temperature gain after 1902. The model still gave an artificial rise in temperature. The unrealistic rise was due to Mann's deceptive normalization model, which was designed to exaggerate 20th century temperature gains. The orthodoxy was supportive of Michael Mann's deceptive exaggeration of 20th century temperature rise. They were supportive of the Mann deception because it helped establish climate alarmism. The non-proved 50 times density CO2 hypothesis explained massive temperatures by a small gain in CO2. However, the orthodoxy's acceptance of the Mann deception required the trashing of the scientific method. McIntyre and McKittrick math correction of Mann's normalization program had demonstrated the bias in the claimed 20th century temperature rise. They attempted to publish this correction in the scientific press, specifically in Nature magazine. They were rejected by Nature. In a self-published website, McIntyre and McKittrick revealed the cause of the rejection. As usual, the critique of the Mann methodology was used to solicit a response by the Mann group. This is the standard technique for scientific correction. The referees commented that the Mann rejoinder was, quote, difficult to read, unquote, and, quote, difficult to evaluate in a short period of time, unquote. In contrast, the referees found the McIntyre and McKittrick critique to be, quote, worthy of being taken seriously, unquote, with the reviewers being, quote, uneasy about applying a standardization based on a small segment of the series to the whole series, unquote, which was done by applying the 1902 to 1980 base period to the whole 1,000-year data set. The referees were positive toward the McIntyre and McKittrick critique and critical of the obscurism of the Mann rejoinder. The referees required more technical details of the critique. When these were supplied, Nature magazine required that the article be cut in half. The authors complied, but with damage to the clarity of their argument. Nature supplied a third unknown referee to the peer review. and then told the authors the subject was, quote, too complex for the number of words which were being allowed to the authors. Again, that is, the initial peer review process was supportive of the McIntyre-McKittrick mathematical demonstration of the inadequacies of the Mann method of incorporating natural temperature estimates with thermometer readings. However, the editors of Nature put length restrictions on the article such that the modifications demanded by peer review could not be made. The scientific corrections of Michael Mann's alarmist temperature graph showing exaggerated post-20th century gain was prevented by the editors of Nature. One can only assume that the editors acted in the defense of the orthodoxy.